You are safe now. Just just rest.
Thank you. Really.
You brought this shame upon us. I am begging you. Let me explain before it is too late. Will you spend the rest of your life with me? Yes, I will marry you. We are so happy for you.
Grace lived in the restless streets of Abadan where life moved faster than patience and survival was a daily negotiation with fate, a place where car horns screamed like wounded animals and hawkers battled poverty with the loudness of their voices, and every sunrise felt like a challenge rather than a blessing. Yet Grace faced each morning with a quiet determination that came from loss and hope stitched together. She sold roasted plantain and ground nuts by the railway crossing, waking before dawn while the city still slept, her hands working tirelessly even when her earnings barely whispered survival, because 3 years earlier death had stolen her mother and left her alone in a world that respected money more than morals. And though neighbors like Mama Tunde mocked her for her stubborn work ethic and her constant Bible quotes, Grace believed diligence was the only weapon she had against hunger and despair. So on one unusually slow Tuesday evening when her sales amounted to a painful 3,000 naira and her unpaid rent pressed on her chest like an unforgiving weight, she packed her tray and dragged her tired body toward the bus stop, unaware that destiny was about to intercept her ordinary walk home, because sudden shouts of a thief erupted from a nearby mechanic workshop and shattered the evening calm, and Grace watched as an angry mob chased a terrified man who ran with the desperation of someone fleeing death itself, and when he stumbled and collapsed directly in front of her, bruised, bleeding, and shaking with fear, Grace saw something in his eyes that didn't match the crime they accused him of, something human, something innocent, and before fear could stop her she stepped forward, spreading her arms like a shield and shouting for the mob to stop, challenging their rage with courage that surprised even herself, questioning their accusations, demanding proof, insisting they search the man before delivering mob justice, and as murmurs spread and the truth revealed itself, that the phone had never been stolen. The crowd dissolved in shame, leaving behind a broken stranger and a woman whose kindness had just saved a life, and as Grace helped the injured man up, listened to his trembling gratitude, and heard his story of homelessness and hunger, her heart made a decision her mind had not calculated, because she knew too well what it meant to be alone in a cruel city, and that single act of compassion would quietly set the stage for a story far bigger than both of them could imagine. Grace ignored the whispers that followed her like shadows as she supported the limping stranger through narrow streets toward her one-room apartment in a crowded face-me-I-face-you compound where privacy was a myth and judgment was free, because when Chidinma warned her loudly about bringing a strange man home, Grace's resolve hardened like concrete cured by conviction, and inside her modest room she cleaned his wounds with gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence he had escaped. Noticing details that didn't quite fit the image of a destitute drifter, hands too smooth for years of labor, teeth too perfect for street survival, but she pushed the thoughts aside, choosing compassion over suspicion, offering him her late father's clothes and a chance to bathe while neighbors protested her generosity like spectators predicting disaster, unaware that in the communal bathroom the man they knew as David was wrestling with guilt heavier than the dirt washing off his skin, because his real name was Daniel Adi, a billionaire hiding beneath poverty by choice, a powerful man exhausted by betrayal and fake affection, who had disguised himself to test whether genuine kindness still existed, never expecting to be hunted by a mob or rescued by a woman with nothing but courage. And as he stood under cold water reliving Grace's defiance and tenderness, he realized the experiment had crossed into something far more dangerous, his heart. Yet when he returned to the room wearing borrowed clothes and accepted her food with tearful gratitude, Daniel continued the lie, crafting a story of betrayal and loss that mirrored parts of his truth, and Grace listened with empathy untainted by judgment, promising to help him rebuild, offering guidance, savings, and dignity without expecting gratitude, while Daniel watched her give from emptiness with a generosity he had never seen in abundance, realizing with growing certainty that Grace was everything he had been searching for and everything his deception might destroy, and as night settled and he lay on a thin mat listening to her quiet breathing, Daniel made a vow to test her heart further while silently praying that truth would not come too late, unaware that lies, no matter how gentle, always demand payment in pain. 3 weeks passed quietly like whispered prayers, weeks in which the man known as David lived inside Grace's fragile world and slowly became part of its rhythm, waking before sunrise to help her roast plantain, carrying loads for neighbors, washing dusty cars under the burning Abaddon sun, and returning each evening with tired hands and a grateful heart, while Grace managed the little money he earned with careful wisdom, saving every naira for a future she believed he deserved, never once asking for repayment or praise, never reminding him of what she sacrificed, even as neighbors gossiped relentlessly, predicting betrayal the way villagers predict rain. But Grace remained unmoved because kindness, to her, was not a strategy but a lifestyle shaped by loss and faith, and Daniel, still hiding behind the name David, watched her closely, studying her actions with the scrutiny of a man who had spent his life surrounded by manipulation, yet finding no cracks in her character, because Grace fed him even when food was scarce, spoke to him with respect even when others mocked him, defended him when insults came, and treated him not as a burden but as a human being worthy of dignity, and each act chipped away at Daniel's carefully built emotional walls, filling him with both admiration and guilt, for every smile she gave him was earned under false pretenses, and every promise she made was built on a lie he carried like a stone in his chest, yet he delayed the truth again and again, convincing himself that he needed more time, more proof, more certainty, until the evening fate decided to intervene, because as Grace and Daniel sat eating beans and fried plantain in her tiny room, laughter briefly easing the weight between them, a violent knock shattered the fragile peace, the sound heavy and commanding like doom wrapped in wood, and when Grace recognized the voice outside her door her face drained of color, fear gripping her like a vice as she whispered the name. Chief Addiwale, a man whose cruelty was whispered across the neighborhood, a lone shark who preyed on desperation and turned debt into slavery, and before Daniel could fully understand the danger, 3 massive men forced their way inside, their presence filling the small room with threat and dominance as they accused Grace of owing 300,000 naira, dismissing her protests, calling her a liar, grabbing her arm with intent that made her body tremble, and in that moment something inside Daniel snapped, the poor, helpless David dissolving instantly as authority surged through his voice and posture, commanding the men to remove their hands with a power that stunned everyone present. And when Daniel revealed the expensive phone hidden beneath the mat and made a single call that summoned security forces, police connections, and unstoppable influence, the truth exploded into the room like thunder, exposing him as Daniel Adi, the billionaire, sending shockwaves through the compound, silencing gossip, collapsing assumptions, and leaving Grace frozen between disbelief and devastation, because the man she had sheltered, fed, trusted, and defended was not who he claimed to be, and when luxury vehicles arrived and powerful men bowed before him, Grace's heart broke not from fear but from betrayal, as realization hit her harder than poverty ever had, that her kindness had been tested without her consent, her sincerity measured like an experiment, and when Daniel turned to explain, reaching for her with apology in his eyes, Grace recoiled as if burned, tears streaming freely as she accused him of deception, humiliation, and emotional theft, her voice trembling yet fierce as she recounted every sacrifice she made believing his lies. And though Daniel fell to his knees confessing his pain, his loneliness, and his longing to be loved beyond wealth, Grace stood unmoved, wounded by the truth that even kindness could be manipulated, and as the compound watched in breathless silence, it became clear that the greatest test was never Grace's goodness, but whether truth could heal what deception had shattered. Silence swallowed the compound after Grace's accusations, a heavy silence thick with judgment, curiosity, and shock, as Daniel knelt on the dusty floor like a king stripped of his crown, his wealth useless against the tears streaming down Grace's face. Because money could summon police commissioners and armored SUVs but could not buy back trust once it shattered, and as neighbors watched with mixed reactions, some in awe, some in envy, some in sympathy, Grace's pain poured out in broken words. Each sentence slicing deeper than the last as she reminded Daniel how she defended him before an angry mob, fed him from hunger, clothed him with her dead father's clothes, and saved money for his future while believing his lies, and Daniel listened without interruption. Because for the first time in his life he understood what true poverty felt like, the poverty of integrity lost, and when she finally paused, breathless and trembling, Daniel lifted his head and spoke not as a billionaire but as a wounded man, confessing his exhaustion with fake love, his betrayal by those closest to him, and the fear that revealing his wealth always turned affection into transactions, explaining how he had disguised himself not to mock the poor but to protect his heart. though he now realized that fear did not excuse deception, and as he begged for forgiveness not as entitlement but as hope, Grace's anger softened into something more dangerous, conflict, because she saw his tears were real even if his story had not been, and after a long moment she asked him to stand, her voice calm but firm, setting conditions not out of revenge but wisdom, demanding complete honesty with no exceptions, insisting on maintaining her independence in business, choosing patience over rushed romance, and requiring truth as the foundation for anything that might grow between them, and Daniel agreed to every word without hesitation, swearing with a sincerity that silenced even the skeptics, then revealed something small yet deeply human, his irrational fear of cockroaches, breaking the tension and drawing laughter from the crowd, including Grace herself despite lingering tears, and in that fragile moment humor stitched together what heartbreak had torn apart, not healing everything but opening a door. And as Daniel's security handled Chief Addywale's crimes, exposing his fraud and freeing Grace from a debt she never owed, the compound slowly returned to normal life, though nothing was truly the same, because Grace had learned that even good intentions could wound, and Daniel had learned that testing love through lies was a betrayal of the very truth he sought, and while forgiveness did not erase pain, it planted a seed, a cautious hope that love built on honesty might still rise from broken ground if given time, patience, and truth. Months flowed gently after the night truth shattered illusions, and Daniel proved with consistent actions what apologies alone never could, showing up not as a billionaire flaunting power but as a man determined to earn trust piece by piece, waking before dawn to help Grace roast plantain, laughing with customers, learning Yoruba phrases to greet elders properly, and sitting quietly as neighbors slowly replaced suspicion with acceptance, because Grace refused to be dazzled by wealth and insisted that love must grow in ordinary moments, not luxury, and Daniel accepted this discipline with humility, choosing patience over entitlement as he learned the rhythm of Grace's life, her early mornings, her stubborn honesty, her quiet prayers before sleep. And Grace in turn began to see the man beneath the money, a man who cried during sad films, feared insects irrationally, and carried scars wealth could not heal, and as weeks turned into months their bond deepened not through grand gestures but shared effort, mutual respect, and truthful conversation, with Grace expanding her plantain business using her own ideas while Daniel supported without controlling, honoring her independence as sacred. And when Chief Addywale's trial concluded with public disgrace and community service, Grace felt a weight lift from her spirit, no longer hunted by fear, free to dream again, and Daniel watched her confidence bloom with pride untouched by ego, realizing that loving her meant standing beside her, not above her, and one evening under fading sunset light by the railway crossing, Daniel knelt, not with diamonds or cameras but sincerity, and asked Grace to marry him as himself, stripped of titles and tests, and Grace answered yes, with laughter and tears intertwined, because she understood now that forgiveness did not mean forgetting but choosing growth together, and as celebration erupted through the neighborhood, Grace insisted they preserve the plantain stand that started their story, turning it into a symbol of grounded love, and in the years that followed Grace's kitchen rose across Nigeria as a beacon of opportunity for struggling women, while Daniel learned the truest lesson of wealth, that abundance measured in love, integrity, and shared purpose outshines any fortune. And their story spread quietly not as a fairy tale but as proof that kindness, when rooted in truth, can transform lives and rewrite destinies. The news of Grace and Daniel's decision to marry spread across Abadan like fresh harmattan wind, slow at first but impossible to ignore, stirring disbelief, curiosity, envy, and admiration in equal measure, because the story sounded unreal even to those who had witnessed it with their own eyes. A poor plantain seller and one of Nigeria's most powerful businessmen choosing love without disguise. And as preparations began, Daniel made one thing clear from the start: this wedding would not erase Grace's past or polish it into something more acceptable, because love that demanded shame was not love at all. So instead of one grand ceremony, he insisted on two, one for his corporate world filled with polished suits, flashing cameras, and influential figures who spoke in rehearsed tones, and another in the railway quarters where Grace's life had been forged by struggle, sweat, and faith. And while the Lagos ceremony dazzled with luxury and headlines, it was the second ceremony that carried weight no money could buy, as neighbors contributed what they could: plastic chairs, borrowed canopies, colorful wrappers, home-cooked food, and loud laughter, and the same compound that once echoed with fear the night Daniel's truth was revealed now overflowed with joy so raw it felt sacred. Mama Tunde cried uncontrollably as she danced, shouting prayers between tears. Chidinma ululated like someone celebrating her own daughter. Children ran barefoot chasing joy they didn't fully understand, and the landlord smiled with pride as if history itself had chosen his property, and when Grace stepped out wearing a simple but elegant dress, her face glowing not with wealth but with peace, she carried her past with dignity, remembering her mother, her lonely nights, her prayers whispered over empty pots, and every step she took felt like a victory earned the hard way, while Daniel waited for her not as a billionaire but as a man humbled by love, his eyes wet with emotion as he realized no business deal, no award, no fortune had ever felt as meaningful as this moment, and when they exchanged vows beneath the open sky, promising honesty, patience, hard work, and respect rather than perfection, the crowd erupted in celebration so loud it felt like the whole neighborhood was breathing again, and after the wedding Grace shocked many by refusing to abandon her plantain stand, insisting that marriage to wealth would not turn her into someone idle or dependent, because her hands had dignity and her work had purpose, and Daniel supported her fully, choosing partnership over control, investing in her ideas without stealing her voice, and slowly Grace's kitchen was born, not overnight, not by miracle, but through discipline, planning, and Grace's relentless work ethic. Growing from a roadside stand into small eateries that employed struggling women, widows, and young girls society had ignored, while Daniel learned a lesson no business school had taught him, that true leadership meant lifting others without demanding applause, and together they built a marriage rooted not in rescue or gratitude but equality, proving to everyone watching that love does not erase class differences by force, it heals them through respect, patience, and shared purpose. And in that union of two worlds, Grace and Daniel discovered that the richest life is not one filled with comfort alone, but one grounded in truth, dignity, and the courage to remain yourself even when everything around you changes. Years passed, not loudly but steadily, like a river carving strength into stone, and the story of Grace and Daniel matured beyond romance into legacy, as Grace's kitchen expanded across cities not as a symbol of luxury but as a sanctuary for forgotten dreams, employing widows, single mothers, and young women who had once stood where Grace stood, tired, judged, and invisible, and Grace insisted on knowing every worker by name, listening to their stories, reminding them that dignity was not something money gave but something character protected, while Daniel watched with awe as the woman who once sold plantain by the railway crossing became a quiet force of transformation without losing humility, and though wealth surrounded them now, Grace kept their home simple, waking early, cooking when she could, and praying the same prayers her mother once whispered, because she feared becoming distant from the pain that had shaped her compassion, and Daniel, changed by love and truth, used his influence differently, funding schools without banners, clearing debts anonymously, protecting the vulnerable without publicity, because he had learned that power shouted was weaker than power used silently, and yet life tested them again, not with poverty this time, but with temptation. When Daniel's business empire faced a major scandal engineered by greedy executives who believed his heart had softened too much, and as media attacks flared and advisors urged ruthless retaliation, Daniel turned to Grace, whose wisdom was forged in hardship, and she reminded him that integrity was not a strategy but a compass, and though the storm cost them money, it strengthened their reputation, proving that values rooted in truth outlast profit. And in moments of quiet reflection Daniel often returned to the memory of that day by the mechanic workshop, realizing that had Grace chosen fear over compassion, his life would have continued hollow despite wealth, and Grace too reflected on how close she had come to losing herself in bitterness when truth shattered her trust, yet forgiveness had freed her more than it freed Daniel, because bitterness would have chained her to pain while mercy allowed growth, and as they shared these reflections with their children, teaching them that kindness must be wise but never absent, their story became a living lesson rather than a fairy tale, reminding everyone who heard it that character reveals itself most clearly when no reward is guaranteed. And when Grace stood one day before a group of young women at a community center built on the same railway land where she once sold plantain, she spoke not of miracles but of choices, explaining that compassion was a seed that may grow slowly but never dies, and that the way you treat those who can offer you nothing defines who you truly are. And Daniel stood in the crowd watching her, knowing that all his achievements paled beside the simple truth that kindness, when paired with honesty, reshapes destiny, and though their names became known, their greatest wealth remained unseen, in a home filled with laughter, truth spoken without fear, and love tested and proven by time. And as elders often say, money can build houses but only character builds homes. And Grace and Daniel's life stood as quiet proof that what you give selflessly returns not always as riches, but as a legacy that outlives money itself. Long after the noise of celebration faded and headlines moved on to newer stories, the true meaning of Grace and Daniel's journey revealed itself not in wealth or fame but in the quiet ripples their lives created, because destiny, like a patient teacher, had used one ordinary act of kindness to rewrite two futures, and Grace often reflected on that evening by the railway crossing when fear had whispered for her to step aside and mind her business, yet compassion had shouted louder, pushing her to stand between violence and innocence, a decision that nearly cost her safety but ultimately reshaped her life, and Daniel too carried that moment like a scar and a blessing, knowing that without Grace's courage he might have died nameless under mob justice or lived endlessly rich but emotionally bankrupt. And as years passed, their story traveled far beyond Abadan, told in buses, markets, churches, and quiet conversations, not as a tale of money marrying poverty but as proof that character reveals itself when power is absent and reward uncertain, and Grace never allowed the world to turn her into a symbol detached from reality, reminding anyone who praised her that she had simply done what was right when it mattered, teaching her children that kindness must be paired with wisdom but never replaced by fear, while Daniel openly shared his mistake, warning young men that testing love through deception poisons the very truth it seeks, and together they built a home where honesty was practiced daily, apologies were spoken freely, and love was treated as responsibility rather than entitlement, and when Grace's kitchen reached national recognition she refused to forget its origin, keeping a small framed photograph of her old plantain stand in every branch as a reminder that beginnings matter, that humility is protection, and that no success should erase empathy, and in community gatherings elders often pointed to Grace and Daniel as living proof of an old truth, that the hand that gives in darkness will be remembered by destiny itself, and when Grace stood once more at the railway crossing years later, now paved and busy, she closed her eyes and whispered gratitude for the pain that had shaped her, the forgiveness that had freed her, and the courage that had guided her steps, while Daniel stood beside her silently, understanding at last that the greatest inheritance he would leave his children was not businesses or property but values tested by fire, and as life continued with its mix of joy and hardship, their story stood firm against time, teaching that kindness is not weakness, truth is not optional, and love that survives honesty becomes unbreakable, and so the moral of Grace's journey remained clear and unwavering. How you treat those who appear powerless reveals the truth of who you are, because destiny listens closely in moments when no one is watching, and sometimes a single act of compassion toward a stranger becomes the doorway through which purpose, love, and legacy enter a life forever